The Kytherian mines of Xerion 7 stretched deep into the planet's core, where the air burned with toxic fumes, and the heat could melt flesh from bone. Commander Sarah Chun pressed her back against the rocky wall, listening to the distant rumble of enemy ships overhead. Her uniform was torn and bloody, her left arm hung useless at her side, and her squad of 12 had been reduced to 3 survivors. "Commander, they're not coming back for us," whispered Sergeant Rodriguez, his voice hoarse from breathing the poisoned air. "The evacuation ships left 6 hours ago." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block out the memory of watching the last Galactic Alliance transport disappear into the stars. The retreat had been sudden, chaotic. When the Kytherian war machines broke through the defensive line, the order came down from High Command: immediate evacuation of all essential personnel. Apparently, a human engineering team trapped in the deepest mining shafts didn't qualify as essential. The third member of their group, a young private named Jackson, was barely 18 and had never seen combat before this assignment. He sat in the corner, clutching his rifle and trying not to cry. "My mom doesn't even know I'm here," he whispered. "She thinks I'm on a peaceful survey mission." Sarah looked at her remaining soldiers and felt a familiar anger building in her chest. It wasn't the first time humanity had been abandoned by their so-called allies in the Galactic Alliance. For 30 years, humans had served as the backbone of the Alliance military, fighting on the front lines of every major conflict, while the other species provided support from safe distances. The Altarians were brilliant strategists, but physically weak. The Centauri were technological geniuses, but refused to risk their long lives in combat. The Vegan Collective had vast resources, but claimed their pacifist culture prevented direct military action. So it was always humans who bled, humans who died, humans who were left behind when things got too dangerous. "Rodriguez," Sarah said quietly, "how many Kytherians did you count in that last sweep?" "At least 200, Commander. Maybe more. They've got those new plasma cannons and energy shields. Our standard weapons barely scratch them." Sarah nodded grimly. The Kytherians were a warrior race, standing 8 feet tall with natural armor plating and for arms that could each wield a different weapon. They had been expanding aggressively through this sector for months, conquering planet after planet. The Alliance had finally decided to make a stand here on Xerion 7, but when the battle turned against them, the retreat order came faster than anyone expected. "There's something else, Commander," Rodriguez continued. "I've been monitoring Alliance communications. This wasn't just a tactical retreat. High Command is planning to sterilize this entire system. They're going to use plasma bombs to make sure the Kytherians can't use the mining equipment or infrastructure." Jackson looked up in horror. "But that means—" "Yeah, kid. They're planning to kill everything on this planet, including us. Apparently, it's an acceptable loss to prevent Kytherian expansion." Sarah felt that anger growing hotter. She thought about her daughter back on Earth, about the promise she'd made to come home safely. She thought about all the human soldiers who had died fighting for species that saw them as expendable. She thought about the families who would never know their loved ones had been abandoned and betrayed. "How long until the plasma bombardment?" she asked. 6 hours, maybe 8 if we're lucky." Sarah stood up, ignoring the pain in her injured arm. "Then we have work to do, Commander." Rodriguez looked confused. "We're not dying here as forgotten casualties. If the Alliance wants to write us off, fine. But we're going to make sure the Kytherians remember what happens when you corner a human being." Over the next hour, Sarah explained her plan. The mining complex had been excavating rare energy crystals that powered most Galactic Alliance technology. The main processing facility contained enough refined crystals to power a small fleet. If they could reach the facility and overload the processing matrix, the explosion would take out most of the Kytherian ground forces. "That's suicide, Commander," Rodriguez said. "Even if we make it to the facility, there's no way to trigger the overload remotely. Someone would have to stay behind." "I know." Jackson was staring at her. "You're really going to do this? Fight all of them with just the 3 of us?" Sarah checked her remaining ammunition. 2 clips for her rifle, 1 for her sidearm. Rodriguez had slightly more, and Jackson still had most of his supplies since he'd been too scared to shoot much during the earlier fighting. "Kid, Let me tell you something about humans that the rest of the galaxy never understood. We're not the strongest species, or the smartest, or the most advanced. But we have something they don't. When everything goes to hell and everyone abandons us, we don't lay down and die. We get angry. And angry humans are the most dangerous thing in the universe. They began moving through the mining tunnels, using maintenance shafts and service corridors to avoid Kytherian patrols. Sarah had studied the facility blueprints during the initial survey, and she knew every shortcut and hidden passage. The aliens were methodical in their search patterns, but they didn't understand human engineering or the ways humans thought about defensive positions. As they crawled through a narrow ventilation shaft, they could hear Kytherian voices echoing through the complex. The aliens communicated in a series of clicks and growls that their translation software could barely interpret. But the tone was clear. They were celebrating their victory and discussing how to exploit the mining facility. "Commander," Rodriguez whispered, "I've been thinking about what you said, about humans getting angry. My grandfather fought in the border wars against the Centauri Republic, back before they joined the Alliance. He used to tell me stories about how humans would fight against impossible odds, just on principle. Your grandfather was a smart man. He also said something else. He said the reason humans always win in the end isn't because we're the best fighters. It's because we're the only species crazy enough to keep fighting when any rational being would give up." They reached a junction where the ventilation shaft opened into a storage area. Sarah peered through the grating and counted 6 Kytherian soldiers examining equipment crates. Their weapons were set aside, and they seemed relaxed, confident that no significant threat remained on the planet. Sarah looked back at her 2 companions. Rodriguez was a career soldier, 20 years of service, 3 kids back home on Mars. Jackson was just a kid who'd enlisted to pay for college. Neither of them had signed up to die in an abandoned mine on a forgotten planet. "Listen to me carefully," she whispered. "What we're about to do is completely insane. The smart thing, the logical thing, would be to find somewhere to hide until the bombardment kills us quickly. But I'm not feeling particularly logical right now. I'm thinking about every human soldier who died believing the Alliance would have their back. I'm thinking about my daughter, who deserves to know her mother didn't go quietly into the dark." She pulled out her sidearm and checked the safety. "If either of you want to stay here, I understand. This isn't your fight anymore. The Alliance abandoned us, so you don't owe them anything." Rodriguez smiled grimly. "Commander, with respect, you're not the only one with family back home. And you're not the only one tired of being treated like expendable muscle." Jackson was quiet for a moment, then spoke up. "My dad was military, Navy. He always said the measure of a person isn't what they do when things are easy. It's what they do when everything goes wrong, and they're the only one left standing." He gripped his rifle tighter. "I guess it's time to find out what I'm made of." Sarah felt a surge of pride. This was what the galaxy never understood about humanity. Other species fought for territory, resources, or ideology. Humans fought for each other. She kicked out the ventilation grating and dropped into the storage room. The first Kytherian turned toward the sound just in time to take her bullet between the eyes. Rodriguez and Jackson followed, their weapons chattering as they cut down the remaining aliens before they could reach their guns. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds, but the noise would bring reinforcements quickly. Sarah grabbed a Kytherian energy weapon from one of Body's and tossed it to Jackson. "These pack more punch than our rifles." Rodriguez grabbed their communications gear. "I want to know how many more we're facing." As Rodriguez worked on the alien technology, Sarah studied the tactical display on the wall. The Kytherians had positioned their forces throughout the complex, with heavy concentrations around the main processing facility and the landing pads where their ships waited. Conservative estimate, 300 enemy soldiers between them and their target. "Commander," Rodriguez called out, "I'm reading their communications. They've got patrols sweeping every level, and they're bringing up heavy weapons from their ships. Also," he paused, "they know about the planned bombardment. Apparently, one of their spies in the Alliance tipped them off. They're planning to evacuate their forces and let the Alliance destroy the planet, then move in afterward to salvage what they can." Sarah felt that anger burning hotter. Not only had the Alliance abandoned them, but the enemy knew about it. This whole situation was probably part of some larger political game being played by species who viewed human lives as acceptable losses. How long until their evacuation? 4 hours. Perfect. That gives us time to make sure they don't have anything left to salvage. They moved deeper into the complex, using every trick Sarah had learned in 15 years of military service. They set improvised traps using mining explosives, turned the facility's own security systems against the occupying forces, and struck at isolated patrols before melting back into the maze of tunnels and corridors. Each engagement was fast and brutal. The Kytherians were individually stronger and better armed, but they were used to conventional warfare. They didn't expect an enemy that would hide in ceiling vents, rig doorways with explosives, or use maintenance robots as improvised weapons. Jackson surprised everyone, including himself. The scared teenager disappeared, replaced by a focused soldier who seemed to have inherited his father's tactical instincts. He suggested using the facility's automated systems to create diversions, and his knowledge of human engineering allowed them to access areas the Kytherians couldn't reach. After 2 hours of running battles, they had eliminated nearly 50 enemy soldiers while suffering only minor injuries. But Sarah knew they were running out of time and ammunition. The Kytherians were adapting to their tactics, and reinforcements were arriving from their ships. Rodriguez, what's our status on the processing facility? Heavy guard, at least 30 soldiers with energy shields and plasma cannons. They've also got some kind of engineer working on the crystal matrix. I think they're trying to figure out how to transport it intact. Sarah smiled coldly. Then, we're going to give them a demonstration of human engineering principles. The final assault began with Jackson using his technical skills to overload the facility's lighting system, plunging the main chamber into darkness. Sarah and Rodriguez used night vision equipment salvaged from Kytherian bodies to navigate while their enemies stumbled in the dark. They fought their way through corridors lined with enemy soldiers, using human unpredictability against alien tactical doctrine. Where the Kytherians expected a frontal assault, they attacked from above. Where the aliens positioned defenses against explosives, they used melee weapons. Where the enemy anticipated retreat, they advanced. By the time they reached the processing facility, all 3 humans were wounded and exhausted. Sarah's injured arm had stopped working entirely. Rodriguez had taken shrapnel in his leg, and Jackson had a deep gash across his forehead that kept bleeding into his eyes. But they had reached their target. The crystal processing matrix hummed with barely contained energy, overseen by a Kytherian engineer who looked up in shock as 3 blood-covered humans burst through the entrance. The final firefight was chaos. Energy beams flashed through the air, explosions rocked the chamber, and the crystal matrix began to fluctuate wildly as stray shots damaged its control systems. Sarah found herself face to face with the Kytherian engineer, a massive alien that stood almost 9 feet tall and wielded an energy blade in each of its 4 hands. The alien was faster and stronger, but Sarah had 30 years of human stubbornness and a lifetime of being underestimated. She fought with desperate fury, using her smaller size and human unpredictability to stay one step ahead of the creature's attacks. When her rifle ran dry, she drew her sidearm. When that was empty, she grabbed a piece of debris and kept fighting. The engineer finally made a mistake, overextending on an attack that should have ended the fight. Sarah ducked under the energy blades and drove her knife into the alien's throat, holding on as the creature thrashed and died. Rodriguez's voice echoed through the chamber. "Commander, the Matrix is destabilizing. Whatever you did, it worked." Sarah looked around the chamber and realized they had done it. The crystal matrix was building toward an overload that would destroy the entire facility and everything within 10 miles. The Kytherians would lose their prize, their ground forces, and their investment in this conquest. But there was no time to evacuate. The explosion would happen in minutes, and they were at ground zero. "Rodriguez, Jackson, get out of here. Find somewhere to shelter." "Negative, Commander." Rodriguez limped toward her, his rifle still covering the entrances. "We started this together. We finish it together." Jackson nodded, reloading his weapon with practiced efficiency. "Besides, someone needs to make sure this thing goes off properly. Can't trust alien engineering to do the job right." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. In a few minutes, 3 humans would die in an explosion that would accomplish nothing strategic, save no lives, and probably never be recorded in any official history. The Alliance would write them off as casualties of a failed defense, if they bothered to write anything at all. But that wasn't the point. The point was that when the galaxy abandoned them, they hadn't given up. When everything went wrong and retreat was the only logical option, they had advanced. When any reasonable being would have accepted defeat, they had chosen to fight. The crystal matrix was glowing brighter now, its hum rising to a whine that hurt their ears. In the distance, they could hear Kytherian voices shouting in alarm as the enemy realized what was happening. Sarah opened her communications channel to broadcast on all frequencies, human and alien alike. Her words would probably be picked up by Alliance monitoring stations, Kytherian command ships, and anyone else listening in this sector. "This is Commander Sarah Chun of the 3rd Human Engineering Corps. Alliance Command, if you're listening, I want you to know that your people didn't die quietly when you abandoned us. We took 300 Kytherian soldiers with us, destroyed their prize, and made sure they know the price of fighting humans." The whine was getting louder. Rodriguez and Jackson moved to flank her, their weapons trained on the chamber entrances as if enemy soldiers might still try to stop the inevitable. To any Kytherians monitoring this channel, you just learned why every species in the galaxy fears humans when we stop being polite. We don't surrender. We don't retreat. And we sure as hell don't forgive. The crystal matrix was starting to crack, energy bleeding through the fractures in brilliant streams of light. And to any humans who might hear this someday, remember that 3 soldiers from Earth were given the choice between dying on their knees or fighting on their feet. We chose to fight. We chose to make them remember us. We chose to show the galaxy what happens when you back a human into a corner. The whine became a scream. The chamber filled with blinding light. "This is Commander Chun, signing off. Tell my daughter her mother went out swinging." The explosion lit up the night sky like a second sun, visible from orbit, and fell across the entire continent. When the light faded, the mining complex was gone, replaced by a crater that would remain for centuries as a reminder of what had happened here. In the Alliance fleet retreating toward hyperspace, Admiral Voss received the transmission and sat in stunned silence. Around him, his staff, mostly non-human, began calculating the strategic implications of losing the Kytherian ground forces and the mining facility. But Admiral Voss, one of the few aliens who had served directly with human units, understood something his colleagues missed. This wasn't just about tactics or resources. 3 humans had just sent a message to the entire galaxy, written in fire and blood. He opened a channel to Alliance High Command. "This is Admiral Voss. I'm filing an official protest regarding the abandonment of human personnel on Zirian 7. What happened here was not acceptable, and there will be consequences." The voice that answered was cold and dismissive. "Admiral, the strategic situation required immediate evacuation of essential personnel. Acceptable losses were calculated and approved at the highest levels." "Admiral," Voss said quietly, "I don't think you understand. You didn't just lose 3 soldiers. You just proved to every human in the galaxy that the Alliance will abandon them when convenient. And humans remember betrayal better than any species I've ever encountered." He closed the channel and stared at the tactical display, with a crater on Zirian 7 still glowed with residual energy. In his long career, he had commanded ships crewed by dozens of different species. But humans were unique. Other species fought for logical reasons: territory, resources, survival. Humans fought for principles, for each other, and for the simple, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The Alliance had just created 3 martyrs whose story would spread through every human military unit, every human colony, every human family. They had taken loyalty and turned it into rage. They had taken cooperation and turned it into defiance. Admiral Voss began composing a new report, one that his superiors wouldn't want to hear, but needed to understand. The title was simple: Strategic Assessment, the probable consequences of abandoning human personnel. He had served with humans long enough to know what was coming next. The galaxy was about to learn that there was nothing more dangerous than a human who had been betrayed and left to die. And humans, as Commander Chun had just demonstrated, had very long memories. 6 months after the Zirian 7 incident, Captain Marcus Webb stood in the cargo bay of the transport ship Meridian, watching human families board with everything they owned packed into simple duffel bags and storage containers. These weren't military personnel or government officials. These were civilians, miners, engineers, teachers, shopkeepers, who had spent years building lives on Alliance worlds, only to pack up and leave after hearing Commander Chen's final transmission. "Captain," called Lieutenant Torres from the loading bay entrance. "That's the last group from Kepler Station. 347 people total. The station administrator wants to know if we can take more next week." Marcus shook his head grimly. "Tell him we're already over capacity. And tell him to stop asking. High Command made it clear that we're only authorized for voluntary civilian transport assistance, not mass evacuation." The truth was more complicated. Officially, the Alliance was not experiencing any kind of human exodus. Officially, the incident on Zirian 7 had been properly handled according to military protocol. Officially, human civilians throughout Alliance space were perfectly satisfied with their treatment and had no reason to consider leaving. Unofficially, humans were abandoning Alliance worlds at a rate that had economists and political analysts in panic mode. The exodus had started small, just a few families here and there who decided they wanted to be closer to human space. But Commander Chen's transmission had been recorded, copied, and spread through every human community in the galaxy. Now, 36 human colonies were reporting population drops of 30 to 50%. "Captain Webb," a voice called from behind him. Marcus turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching with 2 teenagers in tow. She was Dr. Patricia Nguyen, formerly the chief medical officer for the Vega colony's main hospital. He had known her for years through his regular transport runs. "Dr. Nguyen, I wasn't expecting to see you on this manifest." She smiled sadly. "My daughter's best friend was Jenny Chun, Sarah's girl." When Jenny heard her mother's final message, she gestured helplessly. The whole colony heard it. Every human family on Vega Prime. And we realized that if they could abandon Commander Chun and her people, they could abandon any of us. Marcus nodded. He had heard similar stories from dozens of other families. The Alliance had made a calculation that 3 human lives were acceptable losses for strategic convenience. But they had failed to account for the psychological impact on the human population as a whole. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Back to Earth initially. My sister has a clinic in Nebraska. But honestly, Captain, we're not just leaving the Alliance. We're leaving because we want to be somewhere we can defend ourselves. Somewhere we won't be abandoned when things get difficult." The transport journey to human space took 8 days, and Marcus spent much of that time talking to the evacuees. Their stories were remarkably similar. They had been loyal Alliance citizens, some for decades. They had paid taxes, followed regulations, contributed to their communities. But Commander Chen's message had stripped away any illusions about their status. Dr. Nguyen's teenage son, David, had been planning to apply to the Alliance Naval Academy. Now, he was researching human military academies instead. "I want to learn to fight," he told Marcus during dinner on the 3rd day. "But I want to learn from people who won't leave me behind." An engineer named Rodriguez. No relation to the Sergeant Rodriguez who had died on Zirian 7, but the name connection wasn't lost on anyone, had been working on a fusion plant that would have powered half the Centauri sector. 20 years of my life went into that project, he said. But after hearing what happened to those soldiers, I realized I was helping build infrastructure for people who see me as expendable. Let them build their own power plants. The most telling conversation came from Maria Santos, a teacher who had been running education programs for mixed-species communities. "I taught Alteran children, Centauri children, human children all together," she said. "I believe in the Alliance ideal of cooperation and mutual respect. But when my human students started asking why Commander Chun and her soldiers were left to die while alien personnel were evacuated safely, I couldn't give them an answer that made sense. Marcus found himself thinking about his own career. He had been transporting people and cargo throughout Alliance space for 15 years, always proud to be part of something larger than just human civilization. But now he was essentially helping to dismantle that very cooperation, one family at a time. When they reached Earth, Marcus was surprised to find Admiral Jessica Hawkins waiting at the spaceport. Admiral Hawkins commanded the Human Defense Corps, the independent military force that protected human space outside Alliance jurisdiction. She was known for being direct, competent, and absolutely uninterested in political games. "Captain Webb," she said as he disembarked, "I need to speak with you privately." They walked to a quiet corner of the spaceport while the evacuees were processed through immigration. Admiral Hawkins was a small woman, barely 5.5 feet tall, but she carried herself with the authority of someone who had commanded fleets in combat. "Captain, I know you've been running evacuation transports for 6 months now. What I need to know is whether this is sustainable. Are we looking at a temporary reaction to a tragic incident, or something more permanent?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. "Admiral, I transported over 12,000 people in the last 6 months. Every single one of them has told me they're not going back. They're not just leaving their homes. They're leaving because they no longer trust the Alliance to protect them." Admiral Hawkins nodded thoughtfully. "And how many more are waiting for transport?" "Conservative estimate? Another 50,000, maybe more. And that's just from the colonies I have regular contact with. The numbers keep growing every week." The Admiral was quiet for a moment, staring out at the spaceport where human families were embracing relatives they hadn't seen in years. Finally, she spoke. "Captain, I'm going to ask you to do something that might seem strange. I want you to stop running evacuation missions." Marcus looked at her in surprise. "Admiral, instead, I want you to start running recruiting missions. Visit every human community in Alliance space. Tell them that if they want to come home, the Human Defense Corps will provide transport and help them resettle. But also tell them that if they want to stay and fight for something better, we'll help with that too." She handed him a data pad with new orders and credentials. The Alliance made a mistake when they abandoned Commander Chun and her people. But their bigger mistake was assuming that humans would accept abandonment as the price of cooperation. They're about to learn that humans have other options. Over the next month, Marcus found himself traveling to human communities throughout Alliance space with a very different mission. Instead of simply evacuating people who wanted to leave, he was offering them a choice. Come home to human space, or stay and build something new. The response was immediate and overwhelming. In system after system, human communities that had been preparing to evacuate instead began organizing. They formed defense militias, created independent trade networks, and established communication links that bypassed Alliance oversight. They weren't leaving the galaxy. They were creating parallel institutions within it. On the mining world of Kepler, for 38B, Marcus met with Jonathan Hayes, a mining supervisor who had transformed his operation into something resembling an independent nation. "We're still technically Alliance citizens," Hayes explained as they toured the facility, "but we've stopped depending on Alliance protection or Alliance supply chains. We mine the ore, we refine it ourselves, and we sell it to whoever offers the best price." The mining operation now employed over 2,000 humans and had its own security force, medical facilities, and educational system. More importantly, it had defensive capabilities that could hold off anything short of a full military assault. "The thing is, Captain," Hayes continued, "we're not trying to rebel against the Alliance. We're just making sure we never have to depend on them for our survival. If they want to maintain good relations with us, they need to treat us as partners, not expendable assets." Similar transformations were happening throughout human communities across Alliance space. On the agricultural world of New Montana, human farmers had formed cooperatives that controlled the food supply for 3 systems. On the industrial world of New Birmingham, human engineers had taken control of the manufacturing facilities that produced critical components for Alliance military equipment. Each community was technically still part of the Alliance, but they were operating with increasing independence. And they were all connected through networks that shared information, resources, and mutual defense agreements. Marcus found himself carrying more than passengers and cargo. He was carrying messages, technical specifications, and coordination plans between communities that were building something unprecedented, a distributed human civilization that existed within Alliance space but didn't depend on Alliance institutions. The Alliance government was beginning to take notice. During a stopover at New Geneva Station, Marcus was approached by Alliance intelligence operatives who wanted to search his ship and question him about his activities. They had legal authority to do so, but they were clearly nervous about the political implications. "Captain Webb," said Agent Morrison, a Zentori official with the demeanor of someone who preferred paperwork to field work, "we're investigating reports of seditious activity among human colonial populations. Your transport logs show you've been visiting communities that have reported unusual organizational activities." Marcus smiled politely. "Agent Morrison, I transport people and cargo according to properly filed flight plans. If human communities are organizing for their own protection and prosperity, that's their legal right under Alliance Charter provisions. The concern," Morrison continued, "is that this organization might represent a threat to Alliance security and stability." "The concern," Marcus replied, "should be that human communities felt the need to organize for their own protection in the first place. If the Alliance had demonstrated reliable commitment to human welfare, none of this would have been necessary." The intelligence officers searched his ship thoroughly, but found nothing illegal. They couldn't arrest him for transporting people who had proper documentation, carrying cargo that had been properly manifested, or delivering messages between communities that had every legal right to communicate. But Marcus could see the worry in their eyes. The Alliance had been built on the assumption that member species would remain dependent on central institutions for protection, trade, and governance. The idea that humans might create alternative systems was clearly causing panic in the bureaucratic hierarchy. 3 weeks later, Marcus received new orders from Admiral Hawkins. Instead of individual transport missions, he was being assigned to coordinate something much larger, a gathering of human community leaders from throughout Alliance space. The location was neutral ground, Freehold Station, an independent trade hub that existed in the border region between Alliance and human space. Over 200 representatives from human communities across the galaxy would be attending what was officially described as a cultural exchange and trade conference. Unofficially, it was the birth of something that would change the balance of power in the galaxy. Marcus spent a week transporting delegates to Freehold Station. They came from mining worlds and agricultural colonies, from manufacturing centers and research facilities, from trading posts and frontier settlements. Some represented communities of a few hundred people, others spoke for populations in the hundreds of thousands. What struck Marcus most was their diversity. These weren't just military personnel or government officials. They were miners and farmers, engineers and teachers, merchants and doctors. They were ordinary people who had been pushed into extraordinary circumstances by the realization that they could no longer trust the Alliance to protect them. Dr. Patricia Nguyen was there, representing the medical professionals who had left Alliance worlds to establish independent healthcare networks. Jonathan Hayes spoke for the mining cooperatives that now controlled significant resource extraction throughout the galaxy. Maria Santos had become a coordinator for educational programs that taught human children about their heritage and rights. But the most important delegate was someone Marcus hadn't expected to see. Colonel James Park, formerly of Alliance Special Operations, currently serving as military advisor to the newly formed Human Colonial Defense Force. "Captain Webb," Colonel Park said as they met in the station's central hub, "I want to thank you for your service over the past months. The intelligence you've gathered about human community organization has been invaluable." Marcus was confused. "Sir, I wasn't gathering intelligence. I was just transporting people and cargo." Colonel Park smiled. "Captain, you've been to more human communities than any other individual in the past year. You've seen how they're organizing, what resources they control, what capabilities they're developing. Whether you realized it or not, you've been conducting the most comprehensive assessment of human colonial strength that's ever been undertaken." The conference lasted 5 days, and Marcus attended as many sessions as the schedule allowed. What he heard was remarkable. Human communities throughout Alliance space had been organizing with coordination and sophistication that surprised everyone, including themselves. The agricultural worlds had formed supply networks that could feed human populations independent of Alliance food distribution systems. The mining operations controlled the extraction of materials essential to both military and civilian technology. The manufacturing centers had begun producing equipment designed specifically for human needs rather than Alliance specifications. Most importantly, the scattered human communities had been sharing technical knowledge and innovations. Medical advances developed on one world were being transmitted to research facilities throughout human space. Engineering improvements discovered in mining operations were being adapted for use in manufacturing and agriculture. What we've created, explained Dr. Sarah Kim, a systems analyst who had become an unofficial coordinator for the Intercommunity Communication Network, is a distributed civilization. We're not trying to build a traditional government or military force. Instead, we're building a network of independent communities that can support each other without depending on external authority. Colonel Park presented the military assessment. The Alliance assumes that human communities are vulnerable because they're scattered and small. But distributed systems are actually more resilient than centralized ones. You can't defeat a network by conquering its capital city because it doesn't have a capital city. You can't disrupt its supply chains by blockading key planets because every community can function independently. The conference concluded with a document that would become known as the Freehold Accords. It wasn't a declaration of war or independence. Instead, it was a statement of principles that defined how human communities throughout the galaxy would relate to each other and to external governments. The key provisions were simple. Human communities had the right to self-defense, the right to form voluntary associations with each other, and the right to withdraw cooperation from any government that betrayed their trust. They would honor existing treaties and agreements, but only as long as those agreements were honored by the other parties. The accords were signed by representatives of human communities controlling 30% of the galaxy's mineral extraction, 20% of its manufacturing capacity, and 40% of its agricultural production. More importantly, they were signed by communities that could defend themselves and had proven they could coordinate their efforts across interstellar distances. As Marcus prepared to leave Freehold Station with a new cargo manifest and passenger list, Admiral Hawkins approached him one final time. "Captain," she said, "I have one more mission for you, if you're willing to accept it." "What do you need, Admiral?" "I need you to deliver a message to Alliance High Command." "Not officially. There are diplomatic channels for official communication. But I need someone to explain to them what just happened here and what it means for the future." She handed him a sealed packet. The Alliance has been operating under the assumption that humans are dependent on their protection and support. The Freehold Accords just prove that assumption wrong. We're not trying to destroy the Alliance or start a war. But we're also not going to accept abandonment and betrayal as the price of cooperation. Marcus looked at the packet, understanding the weight of what he was being asked to do. "Admiral, what exactly am I supposed to tell them?" "Tell them that 3 humans died on Zirian, 7 because the Alliance abandoned them. But those 3 deaths just gave birth to something the Alliance never expected, a human civilization that doesn't need their permission to survive and thrive." She paused, looking out at the bustling trade station where human merchants, engineers, and diplomats were conducting business with species from throughout the galaxy. "Tell them that Commander Chun and her soldiers didn't die in vain. They died fighting, and their sacrifice showed every human in the galaxy what we're capable of when we stop asking for permission and start taking responsibility for our own survival." Marcus accepted the mission, understanding that he was about to deliver a message that would change everything. The Alliance had created the conditions for human independence through their betrayal on Zirian 7. Now they were about to learn that independence, once gained, was very difficult to reverse. The galaxy was about to discover that humans, when pushed too far, didn't just fight back. They built something better. Admiral Theron Calix of the Centauri Republic stood in the Alliance High Command briefing room, staring at holographic displays that showed something unprecedented in galactic history. Trade routes were being disrupted not by war or natural disaster, but by a coordinated economic shift that spanned dozens of star systems. "Explain it to me again," he said to Dr. Elena Vasquez, the Alliance's chief economic analyst and one of the few humans still working in senior government positions. Dr. Vasquez manipulated the holographic display, highlighting shipping lanes and trade networks in red. "Admiral, human communities throughout Alliance space have stopped selling strategic resources through traditional channels. Instead, they're trading directly with each other and with independent systems outside Alliance control." "That's not possible," interrupted Minister Zorith, a vegan representative whose species had built their economy on interstellar trade coordination. "The Alliance controls the banking systems, the shipping routes, the regulatory framework. No group can simply opt out of the galactic economy." Dr. Vasquez smiled grimly. "Minister, with respect, that's exactly what they've done. Human mining operations on Kepler 438b stopped selling refined metals to Alliance procurement. Instead, they're trading directly with human manufacturing centers on New Birmingham. The manufacturers are using those materials to produce equipment that they sell to human agricultural colonies. The farmers are selling food directly to human settlements throughout the galaxy." Admiral Calix studied the display more carefully. "Show me the scope of this." The hologram expanded to show the entire galaxy. Nearly a third of the trade networks were highlighted in blue, representing human-controlled supply chains that operated independently of Alliance oversight. "This network handles 28% of the galaxy's mineral extraction," Dr. Vasquez continued, 32% of food production, and 41% of manufactured goods. "More importantly, it's completely self-sufficient. Every critical resource is produced somewhere within the network." "But they're still Alliance citizens," Minister Zorth protested. "They can't simply ignore Alliance authority." "Actually, they can't," Dr. Vasquez said. "They're not violating any laws. They're paying their taxes, following safety regulations, maintaining proper documentation. They're just choosing to trade with different partners than they used to." Admiral Calix felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. In his 3 centuries of military service, he had seen rebellions, wars, and political upheavals. But he had never seen anything like this, an entire species peacefully but systematically disconnecting itself from the galactic order. "What triggered this?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The Zirian 7 incident," Dr. Vasquez said quietly. "When the Alliance abandoned Commander Chun and her team, it sent a message to every human community in the galaxy. They realized they needed to build systems that didn't depend on Alliance protection or support. And they've succeeded," added a new voice from the briefing room entrance. Captain Marcus Webb entered, still wearing his transport pilot's uniform. "Admiral Calix, you requested to speak with someone who has direct knowledge of human colonial organization." Dr. Vasquez thought I might be helpful. Admiral Calix studied the human pilot carefully. "Captain Webb, I understand you've been facilitating communication between these communities." "I've been transporting people and cargo, Admiral, same as I've been doing for 15 years. The difference is what people are choosing to transport and where they're choosing to go." Minister Zorith leaned forward aggressively. "Captain, what you're describing amounts to economic sedition. The Alliance has invested tremendous resources in building integrated supply chains and trade networks. Human communities can't simply withdraw from that system without consequences." Marcus smiled. "Minister, with respect, they're not withdrawing from a system. They're demonstrating that the system was never as essential as you believed. Turns out humans can mine their own minerals, manufacture their own equipment, grow their own food, and defend their own communities without asking permission from a bureaucracy that views them as expendable. But the Alliance provides security, infrastructure, technological advancement." Minister Zorth began. "The Alliance provides security?" Marcus interrupted. "Tell that to the families of the soldiers who died on Zirian 7 while Alliance ships evacuated everyone except the humans. Tell that to the mining communities that have been organizing their own defense forces because they can't trust Alliance protection." Admiral Calix raised a hand to stop the argument. "Captain Webb, I need you to help me understand something. Is this a human rebellion against the Alliance, or is it something else? Marcus considered the question carefully. Admiral, humans aren't trying to destroy the Alliance or start a war. But they're also not going to remain in a relationship where they provide resources and military service in exchange for being abandoned when things get dangerous. What you're seeing is humans taking responsibility for their own survival. And if the Alliance were to offer better terms, better protection, more representation in decision-making, Admiral, Marcus said, 6 months ago, those offers might have been enough. But you can't rebuild trust after betrayal just by making promises. The human communities have built something that works for them. Why would they give that up to go back to depending on an organization that has already demonstrated it will abandon them? Dr. Vasquez activated another holographic display. Admiral, there's something else you need to understand. This isn't just about economics or politics. It's about capability. Human communities haven't just withdrawn from alliance trade networks. They've improved on them. The display showed comparative efficiency statistics. Human agricultural cooperatives are producing 30% more food per acre than alliance-managed farms. Human mining operations are extracting resources with 25% greater efficiency. Human manufacturing centers are producing higher quality goods at lower cost. That's impossible, Minister Zorth said flatly. It's not impossible, Marcus replied. It's what happens when humans stop trying to work within systems designed by committee and start designing systems that actually make sense. Admiral Calix studied the data with growing unease. Dr. Vasquez, what are the strategic implications if this trend continues? Admiral, if current patterns hold, within 5 years the Alliance will lose access to the majority of its critical resources. The human networks can survive and thrive independently, but the Alliance economy depends on human production. More immediately, Alliance military forces depend on human personnel, human-operated supply chains, and human manufactured equipment. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Centauri Republic had provided the Alliance with strategic planning and technological innovation. The Vegan Collective had contributed financial coordination and trade expertise. The Altiran Commonwealth had offered diplomatic skill and cultural analysis. But humans had provided the physical foundation of Alliance power. They mined the minerals, grew the food, manufactured the equipment, and fought the battles that kept the Alliance functioning. Admiral, Marcus said quietly, I have a message for Alliance High Command from Admiral Hawkins of the Human Defense Corps. Admiral Calix nodded for him to proceed. Marcus pulled out a datapad and read from it formally. The Human Defense Corps and the communities represented by the Freehold Accords wish to inform the Alliance that we remain willing to maintain cooperative relationships based on mutual respect and benefit. However, we will no longer accept arrangements that treat humans as subordinate partners or expendable assets. He looked up from the pad. The message continues. The Alliance has the opportunity to build a new relationship with human communities based on genuine partnership. But this must be based on actions, not promises. And it must acknowledge that humans are no longer dependent on Alliance protection or resources for our survival. Minister Zorth stood angrily. This is extortion. You're threatening to destroy the Alliance unless we meet your demands. Minister, Marcus replied calmly, we're not threatening anything. We're explaining reality. Human communities have built independent systems because they learned they couldn't trust Alliance support. Those systems now work better than what they replaced. You can choose to work with us as partners, or you can try to continue without us. But you can't force us to go back to a relationship that was already proven to be based on betrayal. Admiral Calix felt centuries of military and political experience telling him that this was a crisis unlike anything the Alliance had faced before. Rebellions could be crushed with superior force. Economic disputes could be resolved through negotiation and compromise. But this was neither rebellion nor dispute. It was the emergence of an alternative that worked better than the existing system. Captain Webb, he said finally, what would partnership look like? What are humans asking for? Marcus referred to his datapad again. First, formal recognition that human communities have the right to self-defense and self-governance. Second, establishment of treaty relationships that treat human communities as sovereign partners rather than subordinate territories. Third, Alliance acknowledgement that any future military operations requiring human participation must be conducted with human commanders having equal authority in strategic planning. And in return, continued cooperation in areas of mutual benefit. Humans aren't trying to isolate themselves from the galaxy, but cooperation has to be based on choice, not dependence. Dr. Vasquez activated one more holographic display. Admiral, we need to consider the military implications as well. Human communities haven't just been organizing economically, they've been organizing defensively. The display showed the locations of human settlements throughout Alliance space, now marked with defensive capabilities assessments. Most human communities now have local defense forces, early warning systems, and mutual aid agreements with other human settlements. More importantly, they've been sharing technical innovations that have significantly improved their military capabilities. Admiral Calix studied the display with professional interest. Show me details. Human engineers have developed new approaches to shield technology that provide equivalent protection at 30% lower power consumption. They've created modular weapons systems that can be manufactured locally and configured for specific threats. Most significantly, they've developed communication networks that operate independently of Alliance infrastructure. How is that possible? Minister Zorth demanded. The Alliance controls galactic communication systems. Marcus smiled. Minister, the Alliance controls the systems you know about. Humans have been building their own network for months. Every human community is now connected through quantum communication relays that can't be monitored or disrupted by external forces. Admiral Calix felt the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place. So human communities can coordinate their actions across the galaxy in real time, without Alliance oversight or control. Exactly. And they can coordinate not just communications, but resource sharing, mutual defense, and strategic planning. If any human community faces a threat, every other community knows about it immediately and can respond accordingly. The implications were staggering. The Alliance had always maintained control through superior information and coordination capabilities. If humans had developed independent systems that matched or exceeded Alliance capabilities, the balance of power had fundamentally shifted. Admiral Calix, Marcus said, I need to be clear about something. What's happened over the past months isn't a temporary response to a single incident. Human communities have built permanent alternatives to Alliance systems. They're not going back to the old relationship because they've proven to themselves they don't need it. Minister Zorth was studying the economic data with obvious distress. Dr. Vasquez, what happens to Alliance systems if humans complete their withdrawal from integrated networks? Minister, the Alliance economy would collapse within 2 years. We would lose access to essential resources, our manufacturing capacity would be cut by nearly half, and our ability to maintain infrastructure would be severely compromised. Admiral Calix realized he was facing a situation that required entirely new approaches. Military force was useless against communities that were operating within legal frameworks and providing essential services. Economic pressure was impossible against networks that had achieved self-sufficiency. Political maneuvering was ineffective against populations that had demonstrated they could function independently. Captain Webb, he said finally, I need you to carry a message back to Admiral Hawkins and the communities she represents. Yes, sir. Tell them that Alliance High Command needs time to consider these new realities and develop an appropriate response. Tell them that any precipitous actions by either side could lead to consequences that serve no one's interests. Marcus nodded. I'll deliver that message, Admiral. But I should also tell you that human communities aren't waiting for Alliance approval to continue building their systems. Every day that passes, they become more independent and more capable of defending themselves. And tell them, Admiral Calix continued, that there are members of Alliance leadership who understand that the old relationship was unsustainable and are willing to explore new arrangements based on genuine partnership. After Marcus left, Admiral Calix sat alone in the briefing room, studying the holographic displays that showed a galaxy in transition. In his long career, he had helped build the Alliance into the dominant power in this region of space. He had believed it was a system that balanced different species' strengths to create something greater than the sum of its parts. But he had to admit that the system had been built on the assumption that member species would remain dependent on alliance coordination and protection. The idea that one species might develop the capability to function independently had never been seriously considered. Now he faced a choice that would determine the future of galactic civilization. The Alliance could try to force human communities back into dependence through economic pressure or military action. But the evidence suggested that approach would fail and might trigger a conflict that could tear the galaxy apart. The alternative was to acknowledge that the balance of power had changed and work to build new relationships based on the reality that humans were no longer junior partners in the galactic community. Admiral Calix activated his communication system and began composing a message to the Alliance High Council. The subject line was simple: strategic assessment, the emergence of human independence. The galaxy was about to learn that abandoning 3 soldiers on a distant planet had consequences that reached far beyond military casualty reports. It had triggered a transformation that would reshape the balance of power between the stars. Commander Sarah Chun and her team had died fighting to prove that humans wouldn't accept abandonment quietly. 6 months later, their sacrifice had given birth to a human civilization that would never again depend on others for protection or survival. The Alliance was about to discover that humans, when forced to choose between dependence and independence, would always choose to stand on their own feet and fight for their own future. The emergency session of the Alliance High Council convened on Nexus Prime, the political capital of the galaxy, 18 months after the Zirian 7 incident. Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat at the human delegation table, watching as representatives from 47 different species took their seats in the Grand Assembly Hall. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now representing human interests as an equal partner rather than a subordinate member. Chancellor Malthrax of the Altiran Commonwealth called the session to order with obvious reluctance. This emergency session has been requested to address what some are calling the human question. We are here to discuss the implications of recent developments in human colonial organization and their impact on Alliance stability. Ambassador Vasquez had been selected to speak for the human communities not because she was their most experienced diplomat, but because she had served in Alliance government and understood how the system worked from the inside. She also understood how dramatically that system had been disrupted by human actions. Chancellor, said Minister Zorth of the Vegan Collective, before we begin formal proceedings, I want to state clearly that the Vegan Collective considers recent human actions to constitute economic warfare against Alliance institutions. We demand immediate return to previous cooperative arrangements. Ambassador Vasquez activated her translator and stood to respond. Minister Zorth, human communities have violated no laws, broken no treaties, and initiated no hostile actions. We have simply chosen to exercise our legal rights to free association and self-determination. You have withdrawn from integrated supply chains that took decades to establish. Minister Zorth protested. Your actions have disrupted trade networks affecting billions of beings throughout Alliance space. Minister, Vasquez replied calmly. Human communities withdrew from supply chains that treated them as expendable suppliers rather than equal partners. We've created alternative networks that serve our needs better and operate more efficiently. If Alliance systems can't function without human participation, that suggests the problem lies with Alliance system design, not human choices. Admiral Theron Calix activated his communication device. Ambassador Vasquez, the Alliance acknowledges that the Zirian 7 incident damaged trust between human communities and Alliance leadership. However, the response has been disproportionate to the incident. 3 soldiers died in a tactical evacuation. The galaxy cannot be reorganized because of a single tragic event. Vasquez felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. Admiral, with respect, your statement demonstrates exactly why human communities felt the need to build independent systems. You described the abandonment of Commander Chun and her team as a tactical evacuation and call their deaths a single tragic event. But for human communities throughout the galaxy, It was proof that the Alliance would sacrifice human lives for strategic convenience. She activated a holographic display that showed the faces of Commander Chun, Sergeant Rodriguez, and Private Jackson. These were not statistics in a tactical assessment. They were parents, children, friends, and colleagues who died believing the Alliance would protect them. Their final message wasn't a military report. It was a warning to every human in the galaxy that dependence on Alliance protection was a fatal mistake. Chancellor Malthrax shifted uncomfortably. Ambassador, we understand human communities felt betrayed by what happened on Zirian 7. But the response has created instability that threatens the entire galactic order. Human withdrawal from Alliance systems has caused resource shortages, economic disruption, and political tension throughout Allied space. Chancellor, Vasquez replied, human communities didn't create this instability. They revealed it. The Alliance built its economy and military power on the assumption that humans would always be available to provide resources and military service regardless of how they were treated. When humans chose to build independent alternatives, Alliance vulnerabilities became obvious. She activated another holographic display showing comparative production statistics. Human communities are now producing more resources more efficiently, with better working conditions and higher safety standards than Alliance-managed operations. We've proven that decentralized networks can outperform centralized bureaucracies when people have the freedom to innovate and adapt. Dr. Serac of the Centauri Republic raised a technical objection. Ambassador, your communities may have achieved temporary improvements, but they lack the coordination and strategic planning capabilities that only centralized administration can provide. Complex interstellar operations require sophisticated oversight that individual communities cannot maintain. Vasquez smiled. Dr. Serac, you're making assumptions based on outdated models of organization. Human communities have developed communication and coordination systems that operate faster and more efficiently than Alliance bureaucracies. Every human settlement is connected through quantum communication networks that enable real-time coordination across interstellar distances. She activated a demonstration that showed the network in action. When a mining operation on Kepler 438b identifies a new mineral deposit, that information is immediately shared with manufacturing centers that can utilize those minerals. Supply and demand balances automatically without requiring central planning or bureaucratic approval. Decisions are made by people who understand local conditions rather than administrators who may never have visited the affected systems. Admiral Calix leaned forward. Ambassador, that kind of decentralized coordination is impressive, but it lacks strategic oversight. What happens when human communities face threats that require coordinated military response? How do independent settlements defend against organized enemies like the Kytherian Empire? Vasquez had been expecting this question. Admiral, human communities have developed mutual defense agreements that provide better protection than Alliance military doctrine. When any human settlement faces a threat, every other settlement responds immediately. There's no debate, no committee review, no strategic assessment period. The response is automatic and overwhelming. She activated a tactical simulation that showed how human defense networks would respond to various threat scenarios. Unlike Alliance forces, which require approval from multiple levels of command before deployment, human defense forces operate under pre-authorized response protocols. Threats are engaged immediately by local forces while reinforcements arrive from throughout the network. But that's chaos, protested General Vrex of the Alteron military. Military operations require central command and control. You can't coordinate complex campaigns through local initiative. General, Vasquez replied, you're assuming that complex campaigns are necessary. Human defense doctrine is based on the principle that overwhelming local response makes complex campaigns unnecessary. When enemies face immediate, coordinated resistance from multiple directions, they tend to reconsider their aggressive plans. Chancellor Malthrax called for a recess, and the council members gathered in smaller groups to discuss what they had heard. Vasquez used the break to review messages from human communities throughout the galaxy. The responses were remarkably consistent. Human settlements were not interested in returning to dependence on Alliance protection, but they remained willing to maintain cooperative relationships based on equality and mutual respect. When the session resumed, Chancellor Malthrax addressed the core issue directly. Ambassador Vasquez, what do human communities want from this council? What would constitute an acceptable resolution to current tensions? Vasquez stood and activated a formal diplomatic protocol. Chancellor, human communities request recognition as sovereign partners rather than subordinate members. We seek treaty relationships based on mutual benefit rather than dependent submission. Specifically, we request formal acknowledgement that human settlements have the right to self-defense, self-governance, and free association. And, in return, asked Minister Zorth, continued cooperation in areas of mutual interest. Human communities aren't trying to isolate themselves from galactic civilization. We want to participate as equal partners in trade, scientific research, cultural exchange, and security cooperation. But participation must be based on choice rather than compulsion. Admiral Calix reviewed the formal proposal on his display. Ambassador, this would essentially mean the end of the Alliance as currently constituted. You're asking us to transform from an integrated government structure to a loose confederation of sovereign entities. Admiral, Vasquez said, human communities have already demonstrated that loose confederation can be more effective than integrated government structure. Our networks operate more efficiently, respond more quickly to threats, and provide better conditions for their populations than Alliance systems. Dr. Serac activated his technical analysis tools. Ambassador, what about species that lack human organizational capabilities? The Alliance exists partly to provide coordination and protection for smaller or less militarily capable species. How do we maintain galactic stability if every species follows the human example and demands sovereignty? Vasquez considered the question carefully. Dr. Serac, human communities aren't suggesting that every species adopt human organizational methods. We're suggesting that the Alliance become a framework for cooperation between sovereign entities rather than a system of control over subordinate members. Species that benefit from closer integration could maintain that relationship. Species that prefer independence could operate autonomously while still participating in cooperative agreements. But that would require complete restructuring of Alliance institutions, protested Minister Zorth. Legal frameworks, economic systems, military command structures. Everything would need to be redesigned. Minister, Vasquez replied, human communities have already redesigned those systems for themselves. The blueprints exist and have been tested under real conditions. The Alliance could adapt these innovations instead of trying to maintain systems that depend on coercion and dependence. Chancellor Malthrax looked around the assembly hall, seeing the uncertainty and concern on the faces of representatives from 47 different species. Ambassador, you're asking us to abandon governmental structures that have maintained galactic peace for centuries. Chancellor, Vasquez said, those structures maintained peace by ensuring that humans did most of the fighting and dying. When humans stopped accepting that arrangement, the vulnerabilities of those structures became obvious. We're offering to help build something better. A system based on voluntary cooperation rather than compelled submission. Admiral Calix activated a strategic assessment. Ambassador, suppose we agree to these changes in principle. How do we manage the transition? How do we restructure galactic governance without causing chaos or conflict? Admiral, human communities have been managing exactly that transition for the past year. We've developed protocols for transforming dependent relationships into partnership agreements. We've tested methods for maintaining coordination while respecting sovereignty. We've proven that decentralized networks can provide better services than centralized bureaucracies. She activated a detailed implementation plan. The transition could be gradual, tested in individual sectors before being implemented galaxy-wide. Species that prefer closer integration could maintain current arrangements, while species seeking greater autonomy could adopt modified frameworks. The key is making the transition voluntary rather than mandatory. Dr. Serac studied the implementation plan carefully. Ambassador, this assumes that all species have capabilities equivalent to humans. What about species that legitimately need alliance coordination and support? Dr. Sirac Vasquez replied, species that need coordination and support would continue to receive it. But the relationship would be based on mutual agreement rather than imposed authority. Support would be provided because all parties benefit, not because some parties lack alternatives. Minister Zorith raised what everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say directly. Ambassador, what happens if the Alliance rejects these proposals? What if we decide to maintain current structures and accept human withdrawal from Alliance systems? Vasquez had hoped this question wouldn't be asked directly, but she had prepared for it. Minister, human communities have no desire for conflict with the Alliance. But we also won't return to relationships based on dependence and submission. If the Alliance chooses to maintain current structures without human participation, we'll continue building our own systems and pursuing our own interests. And if the Alliance actively opposes human independence? Minister, Vasquez said quietly, I hope it doesn't come to that. But human communities have proven they can defend themselves effectively. And they've built alliances with other species and independent systems throughout the galaxy. Any conflict would be costly for all parties and would likely result in the complete collapse of current alliance structures. The assembly hall was silent as representatives absorbed the implications. The alliance was being presented with a choice between voluntary transformation and potential disintegration. Human communities had built alternatives that worked better than existing systems, and they were willing to share those innovations, but only as equal partners, not as subordinate members. Chancellor Malthrax called for another recess, this time for extended consultation. Vasquez knew that the real negotiations would happen in private meetings between species delegations over the next several days. The formal session was theater. The actual decisions will be made in smaller rooms by practical politicians who understood that the old order had already ended. During the recess, Vasquez received a priority message from Admiral Hawkins. The Human Defense Corps had detected Alliance military movements near human settlements in 3 different systems. Nothing overtly threatening, but enough to suggest that some Alliance leaders were considering military solutions to the human question. Vasquez immediately sent response orders to human communities throughout Alliance space. Within hours, every human settlement had activated its defense protocols. Local security forces went to high alert, communication networks shifted to secure channels, and mutual aid agreements triggered automatic support responses. The Alliance surveillance systems detected the coordinated response immediately. In less than 6 hours, human communities had transitioned from normal operations to full defensive readiness across dozens of star systems simultaneously. No central command had issued orders. No approval process had been required. The network had responded automatically to potential threats with speed and coordination that impressed even Alliance military analysts. When the council session resumed, Admiral Calix addressed the new situation directly. Ambassador Vasquez, our monitoring systems detected significant military activity in human settlements following today's proceedings. Are human communities preparing for conflict? Admiral, Vasquez replied, human communities detected Alliance military movements near their territories and responded according to established defense protocols. When potential threats are identified, the network responds automatically to protect all human settlements. We weren't threatening human settlements, Admiral Calix protested. Those were routine patrol movements. Admiral, Vasquez said, from human perspective, Alliance military forces moving near human territories after a diplomatic meeting about human independence looks like preparation for coercion. Human communities learned on Zirian 7 that they can't depend on Alliance good intentions for their protection. Chancellor Malthrax realized that the situation was escalating beyond diplomatic control. Ambassador, what would convince human communities to stand down their defensive preparations? Chancellor, human communities will return to normal operations when they no longer perceive threats to their security. If Alliance forces return to normal patrol patterns and avoid human territories during these negotiations, defensive protocols will automatically deactivate. Within an hour, Alliance military commands throughout the galaxy received orders to avoid human territories until further notice. The human defense networks detected the withdrawal and automatically scaled back to normal alert levels. The demonstration had been subtle but unmistakable. Human communities could coordinate defensive actions faster and more effectively than Alliance forces could coordinate threats. Any military solution to the human question would face opposition that was better organized, better motivated, and better prepared than Alliance planners had anticipated. That evening, Chancellor Malthrax requested a private meeting with Ambassador Vasquez. They met in a secure diplomatic facility away from the main council chambers. "Ambassador," he said without preamble, "I need you to help me understand what happens next. The Alliance is faced with a choice between fundamental transformation and potential collapse. What would human communities consider an acceptable minimum change?" Vasquez had been authorized to discuss exactly this question. "Chancellor, human communities understand that complete transformation would take time and cause disruption. We're willing to accept gradual implementation if the Alliance commits to genuine partnership rather than continued subordination." What would that commitment look like? Formal recognition of human sovereignty over territories where humans constitute majority populations. Immediate cessation of policies that treat human communities as subordinate members. Establishment of treaty relationships between the Alliance and human networks based on mutual benefit rather than imposed authority. Chancellor Malthrax considered this. And if the Alliance made those commitments, human communities would continue participating in cooperative arrangements. "Chancellor, human communities want to be part of galactic civilization. We've never sought isolation or conflict. But participation must be based on choice and respect rather than dependence and submission." The next morning, Chancellor Malthrax announced that the Alliance High Council would vote on a resolution acknowledging the sovereign rights of human communities and establishing framework agreements for partnership-based cooperation. The vote was closer than expected, 26 in favor, 18 opposed, 3 abstentions. But it passed, fundamentally altering the relationship between humans and the rest of the galaxy. Ambassador Vasquez stood to address the Council one final time. "The Alliance has chosen transformation over resistance, cooperation over coercion, partnership over dominance. Human communities will honor this choice and work to build relationships that benefit all species." She paused, thinking about Commander Chun and her team, whose sacrifice had triggered this transformation. 18 months ago, 3 human soldiers died on Zirian, 7 because the Alliance abandoned them. Today, their sacrifice has given birth to a new era of galactic cooperation based on equality and mutual respect. The galaxy had learned that humans, when pushed to choose between dependence and independence, would always choose freedom and fight to defend it. But they had also learned that humans, when treated as equals, were powerful and valuable allies in building something better than what had come before. 5 years after the Alliance High Council's historic vote, Captain Marcus Webb stood on the observation deck of the CNS Resilience, watching construction crews put finishing touches on Freehold Station's massive expansion. What had once been a modest trading post was now the largest independent station in the galaxy, serving as the unofficial capital of the human colonial network. "Captain," called Admiral Jessica Hawkins as she joined him at the viewport, "the ceremony is about to begin. They're waiting for us in the Memorial Hall." Marcus nodded, straightening his dress uniform. Today marked the 5th anniversary of the Zirian 7 incident, and the newly completed memorial would be dedicated to Commander Sarah Chun, Sergeant Rodriguez, and Private Jackson. But it would also celebrate something none of them could have imagined: the transformation of galactic civilization that their sacrifice had ultimately made possible. They walked through corridors bustling with activity. Humans worked alongside Altarians, Centauri, vegans, and dozens of other species in the expanded station. But the dynamics were different from the old Alliance structures. These were partnership relationships between equals, not hierarchical arrangements between superiors and subordinates. The Memorial Hall was packed with representatives from throughout the galaxy. Admiral Hawkins had initially planned a small ceremony for human communities, but word had spread, and delegations had requested permission to attend from across Alliance and independent space. Marcus recognized many faces in the crowd. Dr. Patricia Nguyen was there with her family, now running medical programs that served both human and non-human populations. Jonathan Hayes had expanded his mining operations into a network of resource-sharing cooperatives that included several non-human species. Maria Santos was coordinating educational exchanges that taught cooperation and mutual respect across species lines. But there were also faces Marcus hadn't expected to see. Admiral Theron Calix of the Centauri Republic sat in the diplomatic section, along with Chancellor Malthrax of the Altarian Commonwealth. Even Minister Zorith of the Vegan Collective was present, despite having been one of the strongest opponents of human independence. Admiral Hawkins took the podium as the crowd settled. 5 years ago today, she began, 3 human soldiers died on a planet called Zirian 7. They died because the Alliance abandoned them when protecting them became inconvenient. They died believing they had been betrayed by the very organization they had sworn to serve. The hall was completely silent. Marcus could see non-human delegates listening intently, many hearing the full story for the first time. But Commander Chun, Sergeant Rodriguez, and Private Jackson didn't die quietly or helplessly. They fought until their last breath, taking 300 enemy soldiers with them and denying the Kytherians their strategic objective. More importantly, their final message to the galaxy became a rallying cry that changed everything. Admiral Hawkins activated a holographic display showing Commander Chen's final transmission. Even 5 years later, the words still carried tremendous emotional impact. Tell my daughter her mother went out swinging. Those words spread through every human community in the galaxy. Admiral Hawkins continued. They became proof that humans wouldn't accept abandonment as the price of cooperation. They became the foundation for building something better. Marcus watched as the crowd absorbed the weight of that transformation. In 5 years, the human colonial network had grown from scattered settlements seeking independence to a civilization that encompassed hundreds of worlds and billions of people. But more importantly, it had become a model for how different species could cooperate without surrendering their autonomy or identity. Today, we dedicate this memorial not just to 3 brave soldiers, but to the principle they died defending. That cooperation must be based on mutual respect, not submission to authority. That protection must be mutual, not conditional on political convenience. That partnership means sharing both benefits and burdens, not exploiting some members for the advantage of others. She gestured toward the diplomatic section. We're honored to be joined today by representatives from throughout the galaxy who have embraced these principles. The transformation of galactic civilization wasn't achieved through conquest or coercion, but through the simple demonstration that voluntary cooperation produces better results than imposed authority. Admiral Theron Calix rose to speak when Admiral Hawkins invited diplomatic comments. Marcus had gotten to know the Centauri officer over the past 5 years and had developed genuine respect for his willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. Admiral Hawkins, citizens of the Human Colonial Network, distinguished guests, Calix began, I speak today on behalf of species throughout former Alliance space who have learned that the principles Commander Chun and her comrades died defending benefit everyone, not just humans. He activated his own holographic display showing economic and social statistics from the past 5 years. Decentralized cooperation networks now handle 60% of galactic trade, with higher efficiency and better safety standards than previous centralized systems. Distributed defense agreements have prevented 17 potential conflicts through rapid, coordinated response to